Good afternoon, Jordi. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. I've read your work and followed some of your thinking for a while, so it's great to get the chance to have a proper conversation. And as you know already, I guess this series of conversations focuses on what I think of as the two deepest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and what matters. And I'm framing that in the context of this sentientism idea, which says when it comes to thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason and take a naturalistic approach to working out the nature of reality, if you like. But just as importantly, the question what matters, the clue is in the name, we should grant moral consideration or compassion for all sentient beings, care about any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish or experience anything. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who both agree or disagree with their philosophy, despite my bias. So it'll be great to dig into your sort of philosophical story and where you are now and what its implications might be. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Well, that question has always different answers, depends on the time of the year of my life, because I'm an evolving creature, adding new identities one on top of the other. So because I'm old, my list is long now of identities. So I would say, I see where I can summarize it. So I'm a zoologist who happens to be an ethical vegan. I am also an animal rights activist and an animal protection campaigner who's become now a writer. So all that together. So essentially, I grew up in Catalonia in the Mediterranean, and that's where I developed my identity of zoologist. That's what I did my degrees of zoologist. But then I emigrated to the UK about 30 years ago. I've been living here for about 30 years ago. That's where my animal protection campaigner personality developed, and I started working for many animal protection organizations. About 10 years after, about 20 years from now, 20 years ago, I became an ethical vegan. And then the animal rights activist was born from that. And in that process, I was involved in a litigation that led to ethical veganism becoming a protected philosophical belief in the UK. And that led to a publisher approaching me and said, you have to write a book about this. And I wrote a book, The Ethical Vegan, A Personal and Political Journey to Change the World, who has made me an author. And now I actually live from writing about veganism and animals for several clients. I'm a freelance writer.
Yeah, it's quite a portfolio. What an amazing story. I'm looking forward to the next 6 or 7 decades of it as well. So,
yeah, I mean, I hope I'm not staying with this identity, because the fun of it is just getting new things on top of the previous ones. And I think that's part of what makes you a person, is the seeking for an identity that is not quite perfect.
Yeah, never a journey that is never over. So, yeah, well, that's great. Thank you. A wonderful introduction. So let's move on to the first of these two crazily broad questions. So I sometimes summarize it as what's real, or maybe more precisely, how do we go about choosing what to believe and what not to believe? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in maybe a more supernatural or spiritual, mystical, religious context and society, or one that was more naturalistic, scientifically minded, maybe atheist or agnostic. How they started out, even from a very young age, and how that side of their philosophy has evolved and changed over time and where they are now. So it would be great if you don't mind winding the clock back to tell us your story on, epistemology and naturalism and supernaturalism.
Sure. I mean, you're asking the biggest question everybody can ask: how things happened for you. That's the biggest question. But essentially, I was born in Catalonia. Catalonia is basically a Roman Catholic country. That means everybody that is born there from a Catalan family, the chances is 99% is going to be a Roman Catholic, and that was my case. Spain in general is like that. Catalonia is no different. Sometimes Catalonia varies in many cultural aspects compared with the rest of Spain, but not in religion. Religion is the same, is Roman Catholic. So I grew up, my family were Roman Catholics, everybody was, and I became an atheist as a child. So, and it was an interesting discovery, because I never met one. I never knew that was possible. The idea that there was something else other than being a Roman Catholic was part of fantasy. I never met a person that wasn't of my culture at all. I grew up under a dictatorship. General Franco was a fascist dictator. lived 40 years, the last 10 years or 12 years of this regime, I was born. So it was not just a single country, it was a country and a fascist regime that means completely closed to the rest of the world, to different types of views. And the Catalans, because we were not Spanish, we were oppressed by Franco because we speak a different language, we had different views, and fascism tends to frown upon anybody that is not exactly like the dictator. And that meant my view of other things, other religions, was very narrow because of the way I was grown. And so I assumed that everybody else believed in the Catholic God because that seems to be the case. And when you see films of other cultures, they look to me as if they were learning to become Catholic. They were pre-Catholics. Rather than from another culture with another point of view. But yet, the interesting thing about my history and my way of reality is that I live under an oppressive regime where we survive underground. Catalan culture survived underground. So we could not speak Catalan in the street, but we spoke it at home. We could not learn Catalan songs in public, but we always had somebody looking in the window and then we taught this song. So the whole culture survived. And as a child growing in this situation, basically the message you're getting is this reality is not the real one. What you see around, that's not real. These people that run things are not the right people. This language they speak is not the right language. So I already grew up with a sense of this is transient. These things around me are not the real thing. There is part of me that is real, that I have to nourish, I have to cultivate, because otherwise it will disappear. This oppressive world will destroy it. So I have to maintain a reality against the reality around me. And of course, that affects politically clearly, because that was a struggle that was political, but somehow it put doubt in my mind that this religion that was status quo might be part of this false reality around me.
Is it too simple to say that you were, it was very clear to you that the fascist regime you were part of and that worldview, was false and untrue, and there was a deeper truth, and that you very simply came to wonder if Roman Catholicism was another example of an overarching false worldview? Is it that simple? Or?
It's that simple to remember it right now, but it wasn't that simple at the time to live it, because in reality it was more a transition process. And it was an element missing in the story, which is, I also was very bullied as a child and very low status among my schools. For instance, one thing that you would do in the streets of Catalonia during the Franco dictatorship is the children in the street will go, that will tell you how different that world was to the world we live today. The highest status children were the ones that managed to get more bullets from demonstrations and things like that from the police. And I had no bullets. I was afraid of the police. I was afraid to be killed. So I was very low status because I didn't really like this aggressive, violent thing. I was the target of gypsies that often, there were Spanish gypsies that lived very close to where I live. So I had to be very careful where I would go in the streets. So I felt the world was a completely hostile place to me. In the macro space of the country I lived, and in the micro space of the street I lived, everything was hostile. And then I discovered another world that was very friendly to me, the animal world. I discovered nature had none of these bizarre things that the Spaniards and Franco were imposing to my life. It was all natural, was all friendly, was all welcoming. So I discovered two worlds, one of nature that seems my world, and another artificial from humans that seem completely false. So that is the missing pin of the element. There was a world I knew, I discovered that was better than the world I was living in. It was not a despair scenario where I lived in a horrible world and I didn't want to live anymore in this place. No, I could see there was something better, something more real than this world. Now, what happened though, although Catalans and Spaniards were both Catholic, the Catholic Spaniards were more Catholic, more explicitly. Is the priest tended to be Spaniards rather than Catholic. So the figures of authority were very fervent, radical Catholics, from the point of view that even sects within Catholics like the Opus Dei and things like that, that they are very strict and very fascistic as well. So there was also this link between fascism and Catholicism. Like there were two types of Catholicism, the softer Catalan version and the stronger Spanish one. So that means culturally, for Catalans like me, it was quite okay to distance ourselves from this Spanish radical black and white way of being Catholic. And that means adding doubt to the dogma of Catholicism. If you could be less Catholic, why don't carry on being less and less Catholic? So essentially, as a child, I had this option to remove myself from Catholicism without being in conflict with my culture. It seemed logical to do that. And this other world of nature and reality that I was discovering of how things work, that seemed completely disconnected with the religion that was telling me how things supposed to work.
Yeah. So there was some cultural space for you to progressively disconnect from Catholicism or weaken that connection, and you had a positive pull from the natural world and the animal world. Yeah.
But that means as a child, I developed these doubts about the religion, and without really knowing what else would do, but only that one option is not to believe in God. And see what happens if I stop believing in God. See if I change everything else or something else comes in. So there was this period of fighting because of myself, I want to be an atheist, but I'm not.
And how old were you at this point?
I think probably 12 or 11, I can't remember exactly. But I remember having a turmoil in my brain because I was still, I'm an atheist and became an atheist, but perhaps that period I was an agnostic, but for a short period of time there was this agnostic me that was not quite sure what was going on. But being a Catholic rather than a Protestant Christian, Protestant Christians, in my experience, they tend to become agnostics after stopping believing in God, while Catholics tend to become atheists. And I think that is because the Catholic religion is so imposing structurally from a power point of view, from a political point of view, that it's easy to detach yourself from the entire thing, including God.
Yeah, a cleaner break.
Protestantism, because Protestantism, you develop a personal relationship with the religion, reading the Bible, praying to God. That personal thing didn't happen to me. It was a cultural thing. I was praying to the God that my parents told me to pray to, not the ones I had developed a relationship. So in this country, I actually became an atheist eventually through prayer. I prayed to God to make me an atheist. I found a loophole. In the system. And I said, okay, I got it now. Because I was feeling guilty and afraid. I said, I'm going to pray to God. Please make me an atheist so I can discover you by myself through life rather than believe you because somebody else told me to believe you. Because that relationship that I have with you is false. I'm not feeling it. Therefore, let me find you in the real life. So make me an atheist. If you don't exist, fine, that will be better. If you exist, I will find you. But please do so. And it worked. And I never found him.
It's one of those prayers that actually work. That's amazing.
Yeah, of course, that's what a prayer is. If you look psychologically, what a prayer is, it's not talking to anybody else other than yourself and your archetypes and your hopes. So that was me having that conversation to me, basically saying to myself, I allow you not to believe in things that don't make sense to you. You know, it won't be fine. If you don't believe in them, you might believe them again if you need to. Don't worry. Make this a step. If it's the right one, it stays. If it's the wrong one, you'll come back.
I like it.
Eliminating the guilt, which is such a component from Catholic people. The guilt that was the thing that was gone. And from then, I always been an atheist. And I always been an atheist, and for a long time, being an atheist rather than an agnostic, quite an anti-religious person, not wanting to get involved. I grew up of that aversion to religion as I'm getting older. Because that was a gut reaction from my childhood, almost like religion equals fascism equals Franco. I decoupled that. And at one point in my life, I started to say, okay, I'm not going to look at religion. When I wrote my book, I looked deeply into the religious beliefs that are linked to veganism, and I got interested about it. Now I'm quite interested in secular Buddhism. I'm still an atheist, but I don't have that barrier. That was a reaction against religion created by my.
That makes sense. And it was interesting. I think the way you put the contrast between maybe someone who is more Protestant and maybe has space for a development of a personal relationship with God versus a sort of more Catholic, or there are other religions where again it's more intermediated by the institution, right? They define how it works. And I like the way you put that, because I think you're right. If it's more institutionally defined and here is a block of belief and here is the deity, and if you're not into it, you're out. It's sort of a cleaner line. Whereas it's precisely that what you just said. That is,
why it was easy for me, because the institution was so linked to the political system. That because I was allowed to distrust the political system, automatically I could distrust the religion.
Yeah, and whereas even in some other religious schools of thought, and I think even the spiritual but not religious mindset fits into this mode, because it isn't so formalized in an institution or a priesthood, and you're allowed some space to develop a personal relationship. That gives you more space to find other ways of maintaining some sense of spirituality or belief or transcendence, or a less well-defined God that for some people just softens to the point where it's, well, my God is the universe. And so that it allows you a lot of different routes, whereas maybe a more institutionalized version forces a harder choice. But and it's clear that your part of the reason you disconnected was that political association. There was a sort of an association between the style of the oppression and actually the organizations themselves, I guess, and maybe a tone of oppression and control that you were pushing back on. And that's fascinating, because I think it's distinct in the story you've told from many of my other guests. Because for many of my other guests, it tends to either be a sort of logic, evidence, and reason thing. They've found some inconsistencies in the Bible, or they've learned about other religions, or this just doesn't make sense. The evidence doesn't hold up anymore. So it's more a technical choice. I don't feel this is convincing as a set of truths anymore. Or, and this is a little bit closer to the politics side, but not quite, is they've just saw some of the ethics that flowed through a religious system, and they've maybe thought, well, I like the compassion and the universal love and the community and the caring and the family stuff, but what's this about the homophobia and the sexism and the anti-Semitism and the racism and the threatening children with burning in hell and the constraining dress codes and the sometimes deliberate harm of people who are within the community or choose to leave it. So I won't list too much, right? But it's either a sort of facts and evidence and reason thing, or it's an ethical thing. It feels with you as it was actually more of a political thing. How do those three factors relate in the move?
I would say it's more an instinctive thing than anything else, rather than a rational thing. It was a gut feeling. So, and I think what we do have in common and beyond humans is there is a sense of what's right and wrong without having to intellectualize it. You don't have to read somewhere that says this is wrong to feel that something is wrong. And so it was a very primal feeling I had of what is true or what is false without having to go through a procedure of scientific method to prove it. Yeah. It was obvious that was provable, was false or true, or right or wrong. So the ethics, so the epistemological part of it, this is real, this is not, and the ethics, this is right or wrong, was very instinctive to me. I was a child, remember. I didn't have the intellectual capacity. Even my frontal lobe of the brain was fully developed yet to be able to do the proper philosophy behind it. It was all built from instinct, but constantly cross-referenced with the reality I was experiencing. Now, had I lived in another place, and other circumstances, I might not have ended up where I was. But I think my proximity to nature, or the fact that I was wanting to be close to nature, I was living in a city. That means nature for me was an interesting, exotic thing. Had I been born in a countryside where I was constantly seeing animals being slaughtered, that would have become the norm for my life. It wasn't like that. I was isolated from nature, but I then have access to, by documentaries, reading books, going to the countryside during holidays, or going to the garden and see the ants and things like that. So that role was there and for me to discover, but it was exciting because it was not normal. And so the attention, my inborn attention was towards that world. And that world was constantly giving me information about how things work, competing with the information of humans telling me how things work. So I had two sets of information to compare. And one was so obviously better and more closer to reality than the other. So it was not an intellectual process for me. It was reinforced intellectually through the years, but almost I didn't need to, but I had to be sure that I would find sufficient logic behind to cement these feelings into a philosophy and an ideology and an ethics. And sometimes I moderated the feeling, but I built my philosophy from instinct. So that's how I did it.
Oh, makes sense. And as you were drawn towards that, I guess, the natural world and the animal world, people even there are drawn in different ways. So some will go down that path and maintain a very naturalistic, scientific-minded mindset, facts and evidence and reason. And there's emotion there as well, and there's a sense of connection, but it's still very naturalistic, if you like. Other people will be drawn towards the natural world with a sense of, again, sort of transcendence and maybe a spiritual connection and the interconnectedness of all things. And there's a degree of mysticism linked with their connection to the natural world. Which of those paths have you gone down?
That's an interesting question. I never talked about this, but now that you're saying it, both. For me, it was the interaction between the two that made the magic. It, for me, was the spiritual feeling I had, because I do feel that I have spiritual experiences. I'm not a spiritual person in general, what people understand as such, but I had spiritual experience, meaning being at awe about things that I don't understand, things that are beyond what seems the normal life, and being kind of impressed by how things work, and recognizing that I have limits in my understanding about things. I had this experience by watching nature.
Yeah.
But so to see nature and see how this works.
Sorry, Jordi.
That's all right.
Luna, what's up?
Her point is as valid as mine.
Yeah. She wants to join in.
She has something to say. I mean, that is what just happened right here. This is the essence of my philosophy. You are talking to me, there is a dog talking to me. My attention will be to the dog because it seems more genuine what he's saying. So that bark seems that is more important than what we're just saying here. So my attention was towards nature, and by looking at nature, and then see myself looking at nature, see myself understanding nature, and that's why the other part, the logical part, that amazes me. How it is possible that an insignificant creature like myself, I understand what that bee is doing with the flower. It's as strong about the bee, the flower, as it's about myself. So it's that connection of we are seeing each other doing things and somehow understand what it means. Sometimes we don't, and we communicate, we don't. Like the dog, we just communicated to us. We assume that we know. I don't know what she wants. You might know what she wants. All that communication with reality is amazing. So that is amazing. That's spirituality for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, you got hooked to it. You want to know more. So you want to learn more. You get more intellectualized. And the more you learn, the more you see. The more you see, the more you get at war.
Yeah. I love the way you put that. It's a bit of both. And I think you can feel that sense of reverence and that sense of connection and that sense of spirituality. I don't tend to use that word, but I'm reasonably comfortable with it without having to believe in magic or things that science can never understand. Or it's the same feeling that someone who, is more explicitly magically spiritual and mystical is feeling in their brain. I think I can feel that too. You clearly do. It's the same sort of feeling. It's just different lenses you can put on how you understand that. And we might choose a more naturalistic approach, or we might choose something that thinks, there must be something magical about this. But I think we're probably feeling a very similar thing.
Absolutely. I don't think you can believe in magic. Magic is not something to believe on. Magic is something to be impressed about. And magic is the magic of real magic that people think that there are forces out there, supernatural forces doing things, or the magic of a magician that does tricks. It's a trick, but you're still impressed. And why you like it? Because you don't know the trick. So the good thing about it is that you don't know the trick. And yet you don't explain it with supernatural explanations. You know that the magic of it is that the knowledge that that person has is better than yours and is tricking you. So I think that's the sense. So people are tricked by magic, meaning don't understand how things work. And then afterwards, they add explanations that are mythological or religious. But the phenomenon they experience is not to believe. It is a sense of reaction for the unknown. And that's the same for a scientist that just discovered something that was unknown that moment, or somebody reading a fable from a religious scripture. So it's the same element, same feeling, and the same psychological and neurological phenomenon. And it's afterwards that we decided to frame it into our religion, spirituality, or science.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, thank you. And it's very clear how strong your fascination with the natural world is, because you got to the point, as we discussed briefly before we started, that you once gave a 13-hour lecture called From Nothing to Everything, A Natural History of the Universe, where you talked for 13 hours telling from the Big Bang to the present day. So you've clearly developed an incredible fascination and learning for that and that story. I do some volunteer philosophy talks for schools sometimes. And I was asked that question, how did the universe start and what's happened since then? And I had to try and answer it in 2 minutes, but your 13-hour version must have been absolutely amazing.
Well, it was to raise money for, I was an animal protection campaigner at the time, working in a primate sanctuary, the monkey sanctuary in Lewis, in Cornwall. And it was to raise money to take the monkeys back to the Amazon where they belong. So that was my project. I was the rehabilitation coordinator. So we had a project, they had the money. So I thought, I'm going to do that. But the whole idea is start with the Big Bang, ends with me entering the hole. So anything that happened during the Big Bang had me entering the hole. So I had to summarize it. It was prepared. So I had to, it was an improvised. Everything had to be developed through months of me studying. I bought the latest book of all scientific disciplines and read them. I had pneumonia, so it was good because I was in bed, so I could read a lot. There are many things that made it possible. But the idea is to give a snapshot of what is generally known as reality at that point. Had I had now to do the same lecture, it would be such a different lecture with so many things we learned from then, that was in 1998, to now, that the lecture will be very different. But it will be the same conclusions. That hasn't changed. And the same conclusions, which I kind of felt at the time, was essentially everything is about things getting together, things getting apart. No matter where you look at it, it's all about forces that put you together, forces that put you apart. And the combination of who wins is what you have an atom or radiation, or you have a galaxy, or you have a cloud, or you have a person, or you have a dead body. So all this is the same thing. And still, the more I learn, I still haven't discovered any other thing in the world other than getting together and separating each other.
Yeah, I like it. Well, I'm looking forward to you putting the updated version on YouTube soon. Maybe it'll be 25 hours.
Yeah, perhaps one day. I mean, I had to fight the physicalities of having to do it because it was without breaks, without toilet breaks, without food, without water, without notes. And I think it's the limit. And I couldn't be able to do it. It was on my memory prime. My memory is getting down now because I'm older. At the time, I was 33. So it was a perfect, I could not have done it any other time. But it's because it's all recorded 13 hours, which in a VHS grainy tape. One day I will digitalize it properly and look at it. But for what I remember, there's many things that were not known, like whether the universe is expanding forever or contracted, and now it's known. Evolutionarily of human beings, we have discovered 4 or 5 different species of paleontological humans that we didn't know at the time. But the directions are the same. The same gist is the same. But again, this is just what I knew at the time. That is only because I was born in a particular place with a particular access to particular information, particular books that were written by particular people. And if had been one of these things different, it would have been a different lecture, which answers to the question, what's reality? And at that time, my reality was that lecture, but now it would be different lecture. That means it changes. Reality changes. The real world does change. It's a subjective thing, depends who you look at, but it's also a shared thing. So each of us have different realities, but share elements of it, share milestones, understandings, and others that are very different, others are very similar. And it doesn't matter whether you are looking at yourself with another person or looking at yourself with yourself in the future. You also have different realities then. Even in 10 seconds, my reality will be shifted a little bit. And doesn't have to be realities by sentient beings even. So you can just see how stone experience, if you can call it experience, its own existence. That's a reality that has very little to do with sentient beings. But there's elements in common. We do have atoms in common. We have physics in common. So it's a continuous change of similarities and differences within an infinite array of realities. And the only thing that makes sense when we try to have conversations like you and I are having here is rather than focusing in the real realities of experience, is in those points in common with our realities that seem to be we call it universal, but it's just common among a group of people. And that is what epistemology is. Find the points in common of different realities to the point that we can agree. Okay, we mammals see the world this way, we humans see the world this way, we vertebrates see the world this way, but that's not the only way.
Yeah, I love that way of putting it. And your sort of fascination and excitement with just understanding reality, plays through beautifully there. Reality is awesome enough without us having to make things up on top. And I also like the way you describe that sort of balance between subjectivity and objectivity, because often people think, there's some sort of irreconcilable break. Some people seem to talk as though there is one reality. There's no difference in subjective perception whatsoever. Other people take it to the other extreme and say it's all subjective, right? There's no basis for commonality at all. And it seems to me commonsensically to be as you described. Of course, we all have our own subjective perspective just because of our history, our learning, our perceptions. It's going to be different. Even if they're similar, there's always going to be some difference there, maybe an irreconcilable difference. But as you said, I do think it's highly likely we all share one objective universe. So there's going to be commonalities between our different subjective perceptions. And I'm very glad that's the case, because it means we can develop knowledge together and cooperate and understand each other and develop empathy and compassion. And so I don't see why there's such a difficulty in acknowledging the subjective and the objective.
And it goes beyond that. Many religions build on other realities that are far beyond that. They create a mythic metaphysics of the world, in a reality like in another dimension from which we don't have access to. And of course, that you can theorize about that, and there is no way to prove it or disprove it, and you can play with that concept. But that's fine. That doesn't mean that that's not a reality. It's one of those realities that has very little relevance to us in our way of living. But it's a reality in itself. When you watch a film, you watch a reality. The starts at the beginning, ends with the end of the film. You learn the rules of understanding it. For instance, when you see in a film somebody using a computer, it will always make noise. You know that the real world doesn't do that, but you don't care because you understand that reality. Or when somebody asks for the price of something, in films, they never say, they give a piece of paper, they read it. Yeah. The real world is not like that. But you learn how that reality works and you enjoy it for 2 hours, and then you move to your other reality. That's not less real than our reality, but it's not useful beyond the 2 hours. Therefore, so there are all these realities that are useless or entertaining, but doesn't really help you to decide the 3 major questions that I write in my book. Who am I? What is this? What should I do? These are the practical reality. The answers of these are the practical things.
It's almost like a separate little bubble reality that's useful for entertainment, but it's again,
I'm not claiming that mine is real and the other isn't. The opposite. I'm claiming that every reality is out there, is real at one degree or another. But how relevant is that reality to me is that what matters, not how real it is. It's how relevant.
Makes sense. And I'd also argue that even our subjective perceptions themselves are part of one objective shared reality, because other sentientists disagree with me, but I think our experiences really just are the information processing that's going on in our minds. So I think those are objective physical facts too, however difficult it might be to interpret them. Maybe we'll improve the resolution of an fMRI scanner to the point where, I could run a Jordi emulation and really know what it's like to be you. But until then, we'll just have to keep talking. So that's been a fascinating journey through your epistemology. And I guess I'd summarize it by saying it's a naturalistic way of thinking, but with plenty of space for sort of wonder or even spirituality, and a rich sense of meaning that sits around that too. But one of the things that's interesting as we move to the second question about what matters is that some of my guests, as they've moved away from a religious or a supernatural worldview, have felt a gap when it comes to ethics, because even though maybe the religious ethics they grew up with were, I would argue, arbitrary, some good, some bad, some awful, at least there was a system. You had a book, you had some rules, you had a supposedly perfect God to comply with. But once that's gone, how does a naturalistic person or an atheist, build their morality? So there's really 2 parts to this question. The first one is answering that. It's, how you come to think about ethics and morality, right and wrong, good and bad. The second part of the question, which I think is just as important, is really about moral scope and, okay, who gets to count in our ethics, and how has that changed through your life as well? And you've already hinted at a very early connection with the animal world, and that's in a fascinating. So there are two crazily big questions, and I've asked you both at once, so you can answer them how you like.
Well, essentially, it's an ethical question you're asking me. About two questions, really. Is the question of what's right and what's wrong, the ethics. But I think there's another question after that, is what should I do with that information? So for me, there are several things. One is a theoretical thing, is how you move from ethics to another if you change religion or you abandon one. But that's not enough. It has to be a practical element of what do I do with this? Do I change my behavior? Do I change my lifestyle? And this is more important than the ethical thing. Now, in my case, because I didn't abandon Catholicism, it's like, imagine if I was following my behavior because I had a book that says this is how a Catholic should behave. And suddenly I throw this book. What your question is, what happened between me throwing this book and finding the next book that tells me what I should do? What I do in this gap? Was it a book right in front of me, or had to travel far and beyond to find a book? Many people do that, go to India and discover new religion after that. No, I had the book already open. So I had the book of nature and the book of religion. I closed the book of religion and I kept the book of nature that was open to me. There was no transition. So for me, the ethics comes from instinct, remember? Therefore, the instinct was operating all the time. And I had not to conflict that instinct with what religion was telling me. So that conflict that was consuming, and that was gone. So the ability for me to read ethics from nature was enhanced by removing religion. And so I went into it. That is when I became such an animal person. That even really, for me, that world, I was a teenager, an adolescent. So I kind of assumed I had to live with people. But I thought, that's a bummer. I don't want to. I have to learn how to do that. But there's this other world that I'm really interested about. So my growing up is just growing up to look like a human being, but be sure that I was getting all my facts and information from non-human beings, because they tend to be very wrong all the time. So that's when I discovered that there was a career called zoology, biology first. And so that's where I need to go. I need to go to a human setting that is okay for me to spend a lot of time with animals. It's not it's part of the role to do that. So I had the vocation of, okay, that's the role I want to do. And I started to design my behavior around getting access to the natural world beyond what I could do in Barcelona, just get access to the world in the planet. And yet I still try to learn how to be normal enough so people give me money if I ask for it, give me food if I... So, and I was living with pets at the time. My family had pets, dogs and cats and things like that. We called them pets then. I wouldn't call them pets now. But they become my closest members of my family. So my proximity to the dogs I had grown up with was closer to with my parents and my sisters and everything else, because I look at them as the teachers of how to behave with humans. So they are professionals of that. They live from asking a human being for food and getting it afterwards. So I look at them as equals, not as I own you. So the dogs I grew up with were telling me, look, this is what you need to do with a person. If it gives you a joke, you laugh, even if it's not funny. So it's almost learning to be a human. So I became closer to domesticated animals to learn how to be around humans, and to the wild animal to learn how the world works. And just I thought, that's my life. And of course, things changed politically. Franco died, democracy came to Catalonia. All these things were adding spice and color to all this, but I still wasn't interested that much in that human thing. It seemed logical that the next one in power will end up doing the same things than the previous one in power. So I didn't trust that. But at one point, it became a conflict, because then I went into a degree, I did a degree, and then I was just about to become an academic. And that's a very human thing to be. The scientist I wanted to be is the one in nature looking and being awed, not the one in the class teaching others what I learned. And then I realized I'm moving away from nature now. I'm getting into a profession. And in that process, I had an experience with a wasp. And that experience marked my life from there onwards, because that's what made me vegan later on. I decided to do a PhD in the social, I was an ethologist. So I went from zoology to specialize in animal behavior. Ethology is the science that studies animal behavior in a natural world, as opposed to in a lab. And I decided to concentrate on social species. That's what ethologists do. They look at behaviors and then compare them across the species, aggressive behavior or reproductive behavior. I look at social behavior. And I had to start with something and start with social wasps. So I decided to do my PhD with social wasps. So in my first experience looking at a nest of social wasps in the wild, which I explained many times the story because it's in my books and is the thing that really made the difference, it transformed me because it was a personal experience of what those that we could call it spiritual in any book, because there was a communication between a tiny individual and me that makes so much sense and changed my paradigm. And this was a guard of the wasp. Is a guard, somebody is outside of the nest protecting the nest. If there is somebody who's a threat, they raise an alarm, they leave a pheromone, everybody goes out, it stinks whoever's a threat. So this is the one I had to pay attention, because if she reacted, everybody will sting me. So I had to observe the nest, get closer to it, paying attention to this guard. And at one point, the guard saw me. In that moment, the experience began. It saw me, it realized I'm a potential threat, it analyzed me, it looks at me, it smells me, it looks, and I can see that. I can see the behavior that I'm being scanned, I'm being judged. Her brain is processing information, is reading my behavior, and eventually she decides, you're okay. Your behavior tells me you're just here to watch and carry on the work. And that blew my mind. I've seen people that I explain who I am and they don't even know. And I use the same language they speak and they don't understand. And she just got me with my behavior. And she's tiny. And people kill them when they see an opportunity. This relationship with other animals that we have said is so wrong. They are like cats. They're just smaller, they have wings. But they do the same things. That really made a difference. They said, okay, I don't have to be any longer the guy that is at all. I already seen the magic thing. I already got to that point where the magic has exploded. I cannot be more spectacular than this. Now I have to change the behavior of other human beings and myself towards those walls. Now is the time I have to start protecting rather than observing. It's time to start helping animals rather than just enjoying their presence. I don't have to go into this cocoon of isolation in the real natural world. I have to go back to the real world to change it, because I now own it. I've been given this ability to see this, and that's changed every way I look at things. So I have to become the animal protectionist. Because of that, my career as a zoologist in Barcelona made no sense anymore. I had to go and find something that had to be an animal protectionist, which you could not do in Catalonia at the time. There was no profession as such. And I am here.
And that's a fascinating distinction, because when you started talking about, the book of, if you like, nature was already open, so you had that intuition and drive. There's some dangerous paths on, that people can follow if they take nature as a guide to ethics. So many people will have this reverence for nature, this wonder of nature, this sense of connection, but they still feel somewhat separate for it. It's something that they're intellectually and emotionally fascinated by, and they have this sense of reverence. And there's even a naturalistic fallacy where people will just assume that if something's in nature, i.e. without human intervention, it's by definition good. And to my mind, that makes them blind to the perspectives of the individual sentient beings in nature, many of whom are flourishing and many of whom are suffering terribly. But the naturalistic fallacy sort of puts a sheen around that and says, it's nature, it must be wonderful, isn't that great? And that can feed back into human ethics, because if you start to think, well, we humans are an apex predator, and we have certain capabilities. Life eats life. It's a circle of life. We should play our part in these natural systems. It can even lead people to argue that industrial factory farming is, in some sense, natural, which is a pretty bizarre thing to suggest. So there's a real danger, I think, in using nature as your ethical guide. But the story you told answered my question perfectly, which is you had that moment of direct empathy and identification with the perspective of the other. which to my mind is absolutely central to human ethics. Anyone gets that in human ethics. What we do is we try and understand what it would be like to be the other person, the victim, and we identify with that and we choose to care about it. And in a way, that is morality. But it seems for too many people so hard to make that identification across the species boundary. But that interaction you have with the wasp was a great example of just that moment of clarity of they have a perspective too. Things can go well for them. Things can go badly for them. That has to matter. That was, fascinating.
This is exactly right. This danger you mentioned is for those that take the book of nature and they only look at the cover. They don't open it. They look at nature as a landscape, as what you see from the window.
Yeah.
So that,
or on the nature programs on the TV. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Nature doesn't exist other than with the sum of the individuals that form part of it. So when you open the book, you don't see idealized nature. You see the individuals learning with the good and the bad thing. So when I say was close to nature, I was not close to the artificial nature sold by those that look at it from the window. I was looking at nature up close from the individual point of view. But so go to a field and focus in one grass, and go and look at the grass and realize the interaction between that grass and the grass behind it. And then see that insect that is climbing at the grass and how he's using the grass and how the grass allows the insect to use it, because actually this insect will protect from another insect. These connections is what nature is. Now, there's nothing more than the sum of the connections of all the individuals in the world. And that's what you learn from. When you look at the connection, that's where the good lessons come from, not from the idealistic point of view. So those that you just mentioned that are in danger to idealize nature, they've never seen it. They've never been in nature. They just heard about it. They just heard it described by somebody else. I often meet many vegans that criticize the fact that I'm in favor of rewilding and things like that some vegans are not, because I don't see nature as a place of everybody suffering, as many do. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of happiness. I don't see either way ni the other. When you look at the individual, you see both. You don't see one or the other. This simplistic idea that nature is horrible, is evil. No, if it's not benign, it's not evil either. It's neither benign nor evil. And individuals could not survive and prosper if they were suffering all the time. That would not make it fit, evolutionarily speaking, to survive. So therefore, is this balance. And suffering has a purpose in nature, in a sense of give you information to move somewhere else. So it's a very purposeful characteristic, therefore is susceptible to evolve and get better with time. So the ability to understand reality and to move away from danger is evolving in each species in a progressive way. When you look at how animals deal with issues, that's what you learn the lessons, how you deal with yours. So that means there was this element for me to learn from nature how to deal with reality and the good and bad things. And then through the wasp, and that's not irrelevant, it is a wasp. We're talking about a social species whose job was to protect somebody else. Her role was to protect her sisters from me. It was not her protection that was after, her sister. That's what I understood. That's why I had to become an animal protectionist, because I learned protection. And I learned protection from logic, from using your senses and make a balanced judgment to protect others. Then I realized protection doesn't come from religion, doesn't come from humans, it's in nature. Nature has this sense of collaboration, helping each other, protecting each other. It's already there. I don't have to learn it from any humans. I only have to look at nature to learn.
Yeah, and it's I guess one of the frustrations I sometimes feel is that there are some people who have spent an enormous amount of time, I think, genuinely understanding nature and the role of individuals within it, but yet still haven't managed to play through the ethical implications. And I think part of that is it comes from a human fascination with moral agents, if you like. So we find it absolutely fascinating looking into the non-human animal kingdom and realizing that, chimpanzees care about fairness, or how, social species like wasps and ants collaborate. And we're like, wow, that's amazing. They, in some sense, have a proto-morality themselves. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, where do you think ours came from? So there's that fascination with agency, but there's also this challenge where people struggle to then say, they're also moral patients, right? They're suffering matters too. And I had a fascinating conversation with the previous guest, Frans de Waal, who, frankly, I think is on this journey himself. Right? He's done amazing, groundbreaking work, probably more than any scientist, to help people understand that non-humans have their own morality too. But he's still working through practically the implications of their moral patience. And, this is a guy who probably knows more about the animal world than almost any other human. So I do find that frustration of there's this fascination with moral agency and moral behavior in the non-human animal kingdom. But yes, their moral patience, clearly, obviously, even more obviously. So I don't know if you have a reflection on how, because you've made that more of that journey than most now. So.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that Frans de Waal is where he is, because it makes a difference which part of nature you spend more time with. If you spend more time with primates, you're going to see a primate nature, which is kind of your nature. You're not going to see that much beyond that. You're not going to be challenged to change that much your perceptions. You really, if you look at primates with that, try to find what you behave, the way you behave. You're just comparing two species that are very similar, likely to behave in a similar way. Therefore, your conclusions are not going to be very revelatory of nature. Go to something very different, like an insect, something like that, and discover those things in those, and then the world will change for you. So it's this idea that he would never eat a chimpanzee, but he might eat a cow. But if he had some cows, he would not eat the cow, but eat the pig.
And from memory, where I thought he'd got to, I think he'd already cut out mammals. So he's got to that stage, right? And again, I think it's a sort of a degree of affinity and a recognition that went so far, but hasn't quite managed to make that connection with, fish, for example. Or I don't want to speak for him, but you can see how that, yeah.
Doesn't matter. Everybody's in the same boat in this regard. They have the things that know close, and they make a decision to act differently. Those that they don't understand, that put them all together in I can use that. And the more you learn, you remove some of those, put you into circle of compassion. And the point is, you never stop doing this. I never stop doing it. And I don't think we vegans, if you think as a vegan you have to stop doing this because you perceive the concept of sentience, and you say that's it, sentience is it. So everybody's sentience is in my circle of protection. Everybody is not. It's not. Well, you're deluding yourself. You keep expanding it. You'll see there is plenty of reasons to go beyond sentience into be alive like a plant. And if you go that, there's plenty of reasons to never stop. So the whole process of expanding the circle of compassion is what I learned is what you should do. When you ask the question, what should I do? Is not this or that in particular, is constantly expanding the circle of compassion, constantly expanding the circle of respect, learning more about things that you don't learn, and just remove your selfishness and your egocentrism as much as you can. Try to find this way in which you live, doing the minimal harm possible, helping the maximum you can to those that need more help.
Yeah.
And this is the simple solution.
And I'd love to come back to that, because I think I have some affinity with that, but I think, again, there are some risks with that path that you'll be familiar with too. But before we come on to that question about going beyond sentience, it would be interesting just to quickly understand your journey from that moment with the wasp to, in practical terms, I guess, veganism. How did you go through that process? Was it difficult? Was it challenging? Was it like a light bulb going on, or was it something that took some more
No, it took a long time.
Yeah.
A long work, because of course I got this realization with the wasp, but it wasn't really crystallizing what exactly had to do with it. So there was this conflict and all the things that were happening in my life, that they all were instinctively telling me one answer without telling me why. The answer was leave, go, leave this place. Where, I don't got to tell you. My subconscious only tell me leave. So I left with a bag in my front, a bag in my back, a walk into France, of course, the next country. And I kept walking and using transport and trying to find a place, and without really knowing where I was going for some time, until I got to the UK. And the UK, the first day, my instinct said, yeah, this is it. This is the place that we were looking for. This is it. This is around here. I don't know why, but that's what happened. So then I said, well, this is the place I have to be mine. And I still didn't speak English at the time. So I had to start from zero. So because I start from zero through this process, it took me a longer time, perhaps I would otherwise. But then I started to work as an animal protectionist My first proper job was at the Monkey Sanctuary. I mentioned that record talk I made. That was there the first years, but I was still meat eater. So I was working in animal protection for one side and eating meat. So again, a big conflict, but we all had that. But building in my head that there was something I had to resolve, something that had to be built somewhere. And at one point, I had to say, I need to stop accepting this conflict as if it's okay. I need to address it. And there was a physical thing happened to me that forced me to that position. I had an accident. I fell down the stairs and on my head, got unconscious. And when the paramedics came in and woke me up, I had a dream while I was unconscious. I didn't know that you dream when you were unconscious, but you do. But I forgot the dream immediately, as you often do when you wake up. But the feeling that the dream was important nagged me for some time. And then I thought, I'm having too much of a busy life that I don't even have time to think about the dream and things like that. I'm going to leave this work that I was doing at the time for an organization called Bond Free Foundation, asked for a holiday because I had not taken holidays at all. I was a workaholic, never taking holiday. And I went 23 days in isolation in an island in Scotland, completely isolated of the world, in order to try to remember my dream. And through that process, I wrote a novel. It's called The Demon's Trial. And I became a vegan in that island. So I came back as a vegan. I went there as a meat eater, came back as a vegan. Because I rationalized, I took all my rationalizations on the table, had no time to do that, but now I have. I put anything I believe on the table, and through a world of fiction very based in my life, I identified the myths, the archetypes, the things that make sense, the things that built in me, the things I just learned, the things that are completely false. And I then reassembled everything in a different way, put it back in, and came back to the real world. And that new person was not consuming animal products anymore. So there was a knock in the head that made me vegan, but that is not what made me vegan. That was accelerated process that started with the wasp. And the wasp was started with being born in Franco time. So it's a continuous process that was leading to that point. But it sometimes, like in evolution, was a more gradual progression, sometimes point to equilibrium push of something changing very quickly, very fast. And that happened with this knock in the head. So I came back, and then I'm still that person of an animal rights activist, campaigner, sometimes writer, sometimes, when I still build it on that new identity I built in that life.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm not sure the idea of being knocked unconscious is going to scale in vegan advocacy, but it's a fascinating journey for you.
To be honest, it's not that different, if you think about it, than somebody watching a documentary and shocks you. You're still conscious, but it's a neurological thing that have happened. Reading the book, having a conversation, there are things there's some stimuli that has accelerated a process that was already brewing there. In my case, it was a trauma. Some other cases, a physical experience that has an emotional, but still is a shaking up. It's a shaking up, doesn't matter which way.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. So let's come back to that question about going beyond sentience, because there's at least two criticisms of sentientism. One is you've gone too far, only humans matter, an anthropocentric or even a human supremacist view. And you and I would vociferously reject that. Surely all suffering should matter. There's any exclusion to me seems ultimately arbitrary, whether it's exclusion of certain humans or exclusion of certain non-humans. But there is another challenge, which is, okay, sentientism doesn't go far enough. And actually, that was the first time the word was used, I think, was in the 1970s. A chap called John Rodman, who I think was a biocentrist, was saying, look, you're discriminating against non-sentient stuff, right? This is just the next form of discrimination. The way I've tried to frame sentientism now is actually quite open-minded about that. It says, look, we have to have moral consideration for all sentient beings. The door is open if you want to go further, but you have to have moral consideration for all sentient beings. Personally, I'm quite a strict sentientist in that I think ultimately all value does in some way come back to the experiences of sentient beings. So the reason I care about plants and the living environment and ecosystems and the planet is because of its impact on sentient beings. But other people like you have a more expansive sense that there is even intrinsic value in a tree or a plant, or even beyond that too. And the danger that I worry about, and this is the only caveat, is that it seems to me that the modern environmental movement, for example, has started with a sort of anthropocentric view. We care about humans, at least in theory. There's plenty of work still to do on that front, of course. But then because of the environment's threat to humanity through climate change and pollution and ecosystem services, and because we enjoy it aesthetically, they then jump to a professed ecocentrism that talks about the earth as Gaia and granting rights to rivers and so on. But at the same time, still excludes vast trillions of very obviously sentient beings from moral consideration. And that's what I have an objection to. I have an objection to going too far. And instead of it being a sort of an expanding circle, it ends up being some sort of weird moral donut where humans matter, the environment matters, but wild animals don't, and farmed animals certainly don't, because, we want to keep eating them. So that's my only frustration with some people who go beyond sentience, is that they sort of skip out quite a lot of the sentient beings, and that's not something you do. So how do you think about one, that risk, but also when you think about plants and trees and rocks and rivers, is that an intrinsic value in their own right, or is it the way I think, which is more it's an instrumental value because of their link to sentience?
Yes, I do think it's intrinsic value. I think everyone matters. Anything that you can name matters. Anything that you can begin to think that perhaps one day you will be able to understand that deserve the beginning of a name, that matters too.
Yeah. So you take that you take that beyond bio and living. Yeah. You take that into
everything matters.
Yeah.
That's a very different question of what should I do. Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
So anything matters, because it would not make sense one thing matters more than the other. The universe doesn't work like that. It's not hierarchical. It's not a God that says, I'm going to give you different value to you another. Anything that has existed has the same amount of existence as anything else.
Yeah, we're all just stuff.
Yeah, anything that is doesn't have a different type of is than the other thing that is. It's the same ability to be. So therefore, everything matters. Anything that you do about it is what changes. Now, remember I was talking about ethics and realities earlier, that there are different realities of different people, or we try to see which reality we have in common. Well, that's what ethics is. And that's the difference between morals and ethics for me. For me, moral is this sense of right or wrong based on your own experience, with your own knowledge, with your own brain. That doesn't need to be the same as others, but it tells you how to behave based on that sense. But when you talk to another person or another creature, and you want to devise rules about this will be wrong, don't do it, this will be right, do it, then we have to share our morals and see which points are in common and which points we should disregard. And that's the ethics, the things that are in common. Now, in a world where we try to devise mechanisms to help people to behave so they don't have to choose every time, they can have shortcuts and things that tells you what's easy to do, you need to be pragmatical. And you need to assume that there will be some things that more people will live them very differently, others that will be very clearly in common sense, and focus on the common sense. Sentience is that. Sentience is that concept that makes sense across cultures and everywhere else. Therefore, it makes total sense to focus on having an ethics based on sentience. That doesn't mean that those sentences don't matter. It means that you don't have to worry that much in creating ethical structure to protect that part, because the ones that you need to protect more are the ones that you can say suffer more because they have a nervous system, all these sort of things. So for me, destroying a sentient being or not a sentient being, this is harm. So we'll try not to destroy either, but the sentient being suffers. So if by being destroyed it suffers, that is worse. So therefore I would put my priority to, if I have to choose between one or the other, try not to harm the sentient being. Doesn't mean I don't care about the other one. It means that if I have to choose, I choose the sentient being. But I will want to live a world where I don't have to choose. I want to build a world where there is no destruction. And that's where the vegan meets the environmentalist for me. For me, the environmentalist that you describe is that guy that looks at nature from the window. The one that looks at the environment from this concept of Gaia, or from the concept of a place for humans to be, our landscape. That's not proper environmentalists. Again, environment is as composed by individuals of different species interacting with each other. So a proper environmentalist understands these nuanced relationships. Therefore, that environmentalist will have an attitude of, I want to protect the environment because I want to protect the individuals in it. You can decouple the two. So I come from that angle. So I see the individual. I want to protect the individual and the home of the individual because of the individual, not because of the home. The individual needs that home, so therefore I want to help this individual. So there is a natural progression to me because I came from the individual onwards and outwards. If you do it the other way around, from the philosophical concept, from the religious concept, you might not reach the individual. You might stop halfway through because it's easier. Bigger concepts are easy to follow that because 2 or 3 bigger concepts and millions of different individuals with their own morals involved.
You can stop at ecosystems and habitats and species and forget the individuals that are actually suffering further down the list. Yeah.
Right. And I come from the easiest way because I come from the individuals. But I recognize why they don't get to some point because they come from the other direction. So what's my role to help them? Well, just to show them, to get the individual and put them closer to where they are. So they don't have to travel that far. And so, but they will have to find their own way. I can't just impose it. So therefore, I'm convinced that while environmentalism will evolve, will naturally incorporate the individuals, like, for instance, conservation, which is also much based on species, which is such an abstract concept. This is new conservation, it's called compassionate conservation, that focus on individuals. So there's an evolution of these big isms that will eventually lead to where we need to be, where we understand reality. And again, that reality that I think is the reality that we can share is that understanding of the relationship of individuals more than the bigger pictures and bigger concepts that we construct to make some big statements and assumptions. But I think I learned through my observing nature, and I still do that. My favorite thing to do every day is to go to the park and look at nature. They will always learn something. I learned social distancing. I didn't need the virus to teach me that. I learned it from nature. Get close to pigeon move a little bit away. That's the best. I don't have to get closer. I don't have to. I learned that from animals. So an important lesson in my life, I learned it from a non-human. And then I see some humans, that actually learn them too. And then I get closer to those humans because they seem to have learned them too.
Yeah. And I was lucky to talk to Mark Beckhoff. He was another previous guest. So we talked about compassionate conversation. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm an optimist in the sense that I think that the evolution of all these ideologies, they will lead to the right place, but it takes different speeds and times and more people embrace to them. Now, from a vegan point of view, there's so many people that have bought to the idea of environmentalists before having got the idea of veganism. That it makes sense to use this, to get in and use the concept of the affinity people have with the environment in order to get people to understand the individual, as opposed to reject it and put a barrier and say, no, environmentalists are wrong. Then, okay, let's use environmentalism as it is now to get it to where it needs to be.
Agree.
So,
yeah, and I think
so I don't fight these sort of things. I feel myself an environmentalist. I'm a vegan. So the fact that I'm not expressing my environmentalism exactly as anybody else doesn't matter. That's how it works and sort of thing.
Yeah.
General ideas and variation within them.
Yeah, and we can work on those different perspectives and where, again, find areas of common ground. And I think in a moment we'll come on to that in the final question about how we can make a better future too. And I think your perspective, again, drawing it back down to the individual, is absolutely the key to avoiding the risks I mentioned earlier on, because there is a danger in this sense of, we are all stuff. There is no hierarchy. Everything matters. There's a risk that people will go from that to saying, therefore, there is no moral difference between cutting a pig and cutting a freshly picked carrot, because we're all matter, we're all stuff. There's no hierarchy. And I think there's two things that you do that mean you certainly don't fall into that trap. One is one is the recognition that even if the carrot does matter, the capacity to suffer is something additional on top of that we have to grant moral salience to in its own right. So even if you care about everything, there is still some privileged, justifiable role for sentient beings. But I think it's also drawing it back to the individual as well, because I think you could, in a sense, and some of my previous guests have suggested this approach. They should say, look, you can say, let's grant moral consideration to all sentient beings and do it that way. Or you can say, let's grant moral consideration to everything and then take everything's interest into account. And then you go, okay, well, here's a cow, right? It wants to have a happy life. It doesn't want to be hurt. It wants to live with its family. It wants sustenance and shelter and social relationships. And so those are its interests. Let's respect those. Here's a rock. we give it full moral consideration. It has no interests. We're done. So in a way, it's a different way of ending up at the same practical implication, which is, you can grant respect to the individual rock if you like, but ultimately it doesn't really care either way. So it draws you back to that sentience as still something that's salient when it comes to the practice.
It's a matter of approach as well. You're right. But in my way of looking at it, I want to expand my circle of compassion. I want to go beyond every day. So I want to be in that position one day that I see that rock and I will say, I'm not going to harm that rock, even if it doesn't have a nervous system. I could destroy it, I could throw it. And then thinking, hold on, I'm already doing this. Every time I go to the countryside, I'm not take a rock and break it. I look at a rock and I look at a plant and I just look around. I don't try not to break anything. I'm already doing it. I don't need to change my completely radical my way of looking at it just by trying to respect everybody. You talk about the carrot. I have in my own backyard veganic garden here. I eat carrots. I don't look at it the same way as an animal, but I think, how can I be more respectful for this carrot? You know what I do? I don't kill it. I eat half of the carrot and I plant it again, and it grows again. I eat the other half and I plant it again. It goes away. That's how I do it now. Why? Nobody's looking at this, me doing it. Why? It's not I'm trying to send a message. I'm exploring the expansion of my circle of compassion, thinking, I don't want to stop.
Yeah.
I want to go as far. At one point, I might have to, because nature or circumstances will force me to make a choice. But what if that never happens? So how far can I go? How far can I go? And I don't have to make it a religion. I don't have to make it a philosophy. I just need to make it a moral direction, a moral compass. And I think what we need to agree, the ethics, is the minimum we should do. Don't hurt sentient beings. That's the philosophy of veganism. But if you stayed with that, you just really haven't got halfway. Then from that minimum, build your morals as far as you can go. Beyond, expand your circle of compassion as wide as you can. With respect as wide you can. See where it leads you. And I guarantee you, it's not going to lead you to a bad place.
Yeah. No, I love it. That's a fascinating, generous perspective. So, and so let's come on to this final, also crazily big question, which is, how can we make a better future? So in a sense, I think we agree on taking a broadly naturalistic approach to the world. Engaging honestly with reality is probably the best way of understanding it. And there's plenty of awe and wonder in reality. And we agree at least on granting moral consideration to all sentient beings, although you might be more generous and more pushing beyond where I am. But I think we'd all agree about the moral salience of sentient beings. And I think those stances both feel almost self-evident to us, but nearly everyone on the planet disagrees. So in that with one or both, and certainly in practice. So in that context, how do you think about the future and how we can make a better world? And you might want to answer that in a sort of utopian Star Trek vision of where we might be able to get to, or you might want to talk more pragmatically about social change and how to influence and how to drive positive change. And you wrote a recent fascinating article, a thought experiment, what if the world went vegan overnight, which is, again, I think we need to do more of this type of thinking, because in a sense, it does feel like we're on the point of having won the moral argument. We need to actually get much more practical and think about transition and what ifs and how are we actually going to make these things happen. So again, a crazily big question, but how do you think about the future and making it better?
Right. Okay, first thing to say, and I have to say this, and I said this to myself every time I write something like this, is I have no idea. The future is unknown. There's nothing in my brain that tells me that I have a higher probability to guess what would happen than anybody else. So it's all speculation, 100% speculation. But what I do think is that if you have to decide what to do right now, and you are a mammal with a brain like a primate like ourselves that has the ability to have a memory that remember what you did yesterday, and has the ability to conceptualize things you can project in the future, it makes sense to use those abilities to inform your decision about today. So that's what my book is a bit about, Ethical Vegan, because I write a lot about the history of veganism and how we got there, looking at the past. And the last chapter is also looking at the future, where we need to go. Not because I'm thinking that's the future we're going to get, it's because I think we need that future to know what we do. So we need to look back and imagine and dream in the future to have a grounded position of where we are now. So the good exercise of speculating about the future is nothing to do about being a prophecy or even be right. It's just about finding out whether what you're doing now makes sense in a collective way. Because for that to make sense, it has to be compatible with the past and the next step, with the previous step and the next step. When you ask me the question is, where are we going? So that's what you're asking, where are we going? And when you any group of people that has been in that position of going somewhere, in a very instinctive way, without having to follow any written rule by anybody else, they do the same thing. They look at the back. Oh, that's where I'm coming from. They look at front, different ways to go. They make a judgment. They say, I'm going to try this way. And then they see something I didn't see before, and they change their mind, and they move. So they have an idea where they want to go, but they don't know how to get there. And because they've been somewhere else, they have an idea of what is going to happen next if they take this step or the next step. So that's what this exercise should be. So having been evolving into where we are now, this concept of Ahimsa, which I very much believe about, I think is the basis of veganism. I think veganism is the current manifestation, the modern secular manifestation of Ahimsa. But this idea of doing no harm, which is what Ahimsa means in Sanskrit, is a principle important in Jainism, Buddhism, Vegetarianism, many religions. I think it's biological. I don't think it's cultural. I think it's in nature. In my book, talk about this. I think this idea of doing no harm is actually better than doing harm in general, no matter who. Yeah.
Not all the time, but yeah.
Not all the time, but as a base moral position, that's again, I go to the park, I see animals, they constantly see Ahimsa. Any animal around could harm me and doesn't.
Yeah.
Why does it harm me?
Cooperation is generally adaptive, fortunately.
They decided this is a better deal for me.
Yeah.
So I see it across the species, and studying animals have you seen more in much more specific ways, but in general ways. So that manifests itself in the ancient times with this word. Ahimsa has evolved into vegetarianism, and then evolved into the vegan society, become secularized from particular religions. We have veganism now, might be another word in the future. But in order to by looking at this, we can see that Ahimsa is gaining terrain. He's appeared and is expanding and is evolving and is getting stronger. So that's what tells me the future is going to be that. It's going to be more Ahimsa in the future because it was less Ahimsa in the past. And that's where we're going. So therefore, what it means, this future is the future of do no harm. This is what I call the vegan wall. So I think the vegan wall is inevitable for two reasons. Either we manage to get Ahimsa dominate at one point and that becomes the norm of how things work, or we get extinct, which will be a vegan wall too. So there is
one way or the other.
Exactly, one way or the other. But going back is what I don't think we're going to be doing. That's not how evolution works. Sometimes it does. Things get normally more complicated. Sometimes they don't. Flies have 2 wings. All insects have 4. Flies have 2. They lost 2. They got backwards. So therefore, it might be we go back. But generally speaking, I think we're going to progress. We're going to see more Ahimsa. Now, how long is it going to take to get to the perfect vegan world? When I write about it, I write the perfect vegan world. How far can I imagine getting rid of all the problems and how this is easy to do? And I think we have to do it because without having that vision where we're going to go, that first step we're going to take might be in the wrong direction. We need to imagine where we're going, even if we don't know how, in order to start moving and start informing ourselves with each step we make, how close or how far away from that dream. So I think it's essential that we dream in the perfect vegan world. And that's what I've been trying to do with my writings. But how are we going to get there? I have not a clue. Not a clue. I just only know one tactic. And I learned this from nature. Again, whoever taught me everything. One tactic is if you increase variability, and nature is biodiversity, in this case, intellectual diversity, in either ideas or methods or tactics, the probability that one of those is the right one increases. Try to many different things, many different point of view, many different approaches. That's why I'm also an intersectional vegan. I also think, okay, there are cultures there that might have a different way of interpreting veganism that we don't even hear their opinion. We need to break the barrier. We need to start connecting cultures and genders and discriminations and things. We struggle, we see animals struggling, other people are struggling for other reasons. What's in common? Can we join forces? How do they see the animal? Do they see things that I don't see? I want to learn this. That's what intersectionalism is. So that moving towards starting to increase variability of opinions, and then hoping there will be a natural phenomenon of natural selection that will lead us to the place, because there's a force, Ahimsa, pushing towards that. So because Ahimsa is pushing, it's just waiting for us to have the right thing and then push us in the right time. So I think there is a almost cosmological force, which is, but almost from a narrative point of view, it's easy to understand. You think about this way. I was saying earlier, two things that in the world, things that put together and things that separate. So the things that put us together, that's the Ahimsa. There is something in the world that is not about destroying and expanding on it. It's also about getting together in collaboration. From that, Ahimsa comes. From that, evolution moves forward. Kept doing that, and we either don't make it, the planet is too hot, we'll die. But if we do, the chances we're going to get the bigger world. But so how can I do now? What can I do now to help to get there as soon as possible? Increase variability, diversity of methods, opinions, point of view, without abandoning Ahimsa. Have Ahimsa always there in the background, realizing how important it is. And in my writings, I use this concept, Ahimsa politics. So at one point in that vegan world, politics will be so different that we can call it Ahimsa politics, where it's not about winning elections anymore. It's not about winning. It's not about being more powerful, which is what politics today say. It's about doing no harm. The one that does less harm is the one that has more control about things. So that world is far from where we are now. I don't know how we're going to get there, but we need to think about it in order to be sure that each step we make is not moving our way.
And I love that combination of, a radical pluralism of approaches and perspectives, but a common agreed foundation, if you like, that ahimsa, that compassion, that do no harm at the core of it. And in a way, there's a parallel with how I'm trying to frame the sentientism idea, is it's really irritatingly neutral. It just says, when it comes to thinking about what to believe, use a naturalistic approach, because otherwise you're probably believing fabrications, and that doesn't turn out well. And when you have compassion, at least have compassion for all sentient beings. But beyond that, there's a dazzling variety of different perspectives, approaches, tactics, beliefs. There's so much still to argue and fight over. And like you, I think that's an enormously healthy thing, because the more ideas there are, the more likely we'll find the good ones. So it's quite an interesting balance between a sort of solid, established, but very broad platform, and then dazzling plurality on top of that.
Yeah.
And
again,
we've talked.
Think about nature again. Ants. You see an ant colony going from here to there. Who's decided that? The queen? No, the queen only breeds. Who is decided that colony from going from here? Is the collective tiny decisions of each individual. One would find that advantage is strength. So this is the kind of thing I see again. Is the collective joint effort with different approaches, different nuanced approaches and understandings. And therefore, I'm very much into this idea of listen to other people's ways of being vegan and tolerate divergence of veganism up to degree, and recognize what is necessary to be the same and constant and what's allowed to be different and varied. And not choose any other, choose them all. It's like if you were traveling, you need somebody looking at the map, another looking at the compass to know whether you're going north or east, another looking at down so you don't trip with a stone, another looking with the binoculars. You can't get to the destination if everybody has a binocular, only people looking at on the ground. You need all these skills, and then you need to be able to turn if there's something you kind of grow and choose a shortcut if somebody discovers it, because it was an explorer that went alone, completely out of everybody else, and discovered a shortcut. And listen to the explorer too. Listen to that one that goes crazy. It doesn't seem to follow everybody else because it might open the door to you. So, and have that open understanding that we're going together. This is not me telling you what to do. This is all us finding how to get to the world. But have that idea where we're going, have the idea that we need to move, we can just stay there, and don't care that much if somebody makes a mistake. That's part of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Learning from our mistakes.
I think that's an inspiring approach. Now, there's a sense, I think some people listening to this might feel that it's focused on, yes, the individual, our individual morality, but also organically how 7.8 billion of us you negotiate to work out what to do and what ideas might emerge from that, like an ant colony. But of course, given we're humans, we also have quite a lot of formal institutional stuff going on as well, right? So we have the UN, and we have regional geopolitical structures, and we have national governments, and we have local governments, and we have policies, and we have laws and regulations, and all of this superstructure, which often feels much less organic, let lots of ideas bloom and the best ones will emerge and drive forward. And part of the subtitle of your book talks about a political journey, and you've obviously had a direct experience of how the law thinks about worldviews and these different views. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but what's your sense on the more formal institutional side of politics and law and regulation, and how and if we can influence those in a positive direction as well as individually?
Those institutions are to politics what species are to biology. They don't exist. They're composed by people. Species are composed by individuals. Institutions are composed by individuals. It doesn't matter how you name it, what the remit. The individuals change the rules when it's convenient. The individuals start and destroy institutions. So it's all about the individual in nature, and it's all about the individual in politics as well. So if you have enough individuals, they will change the institutions. They will change policy. So how you get
particularly if they're the powerful ones.
Yeah, but also you don't need everyone. It doesn't work like that. In like evolution, you don't need to everyone evolve in the same direction. Some evolve, and there's critical mass. This concept of critical mass is important in sociology and politics. There's a particular number of individuals that is enough to make a change. And that works in democracies because we have voting systems. But many of these institutions have nothing to do with democracy. It's not that they're voted into existence, but it will have to be somebody directing them. That person has to be taken from the population. And randomly, if there are more vegans in that population, there's a chance that a person is going to be vegan. So therefore, it is a numbers issue. Look at nature. Nature's a numbers issue. It doesn't survive the one is best. Survives the one that reproduces more in the circumstances of that particular environment and habitat. So it's a numbers issues. So you can qualify from quantity and quantify from quality. But in reality, it's again very organic. It's very difficult to design this. And anybody that tells you this is how you design a revolution doesn't know a revolution. Revolutions are by definition chaotic. So they don't evolve from, they might be sparkled by people. And we look back at revolutions and we like to say, so-and-so started this revolution. But in reality, on the ground at the time, everybody did it in different ways. Something make it to history books, some things didn't make it to history books. So it might be an evolution or a revolution, depends how fast and radical the change is with the amount of time. But that, like in my writings about the future, that will have to incorporate politics. We can't separate politics from this. So the moment you start talking about veganism, you're talking about all dimensions of human existence, politics. And not just that, people often forget arts, for instance.
Yeah.
Because Sentientism that focus so much on the issue of reality and evidence-based, there are currently only few part of human institutions that do that. Science is one of them. Law is another of them. Almost everything else is based in false reality. Cinema, theater, politics has nothing to do with reality. It's about winning elections. So almost everything that the person do, 99% of the person do during the day has nothing to do with reality, unless you're a scientist or you're a judge or you're a lawyer and things like that. So that if we just have to rely on getting everybody to learn how to differentiate reality or not from a scientific or legal point of view, we're not going to get there. So who they fit the information about what to do, mostly from the arts world.
Yeah, narrative, stories, culture, language.
There are other realities that have an underlying message that applies to your reality. So this is the one that we can ignore. So we have to get to that vegan world. It's not just, and to get to the politicians, we need storytellers telling about that world. In all dimensions, in all sides of arts and films and photography and literature and paintings. So get the arts there, because the arts have more weight these days in the ears of the average citizen. So it's not enough if you just go doing vegan outreach in the street. If that person goes back home and sees a film that's going to send the message, cows are delicious. So that's not going to work. We need that film to be changed, not the documentary about elephants. That mainstream film that doesn't even have anything that makes you think there is a big message behind. Yeah. That's the one that has a big message.
Yeah, and I think it's so obviously true, and I still find it a little frustrating because I guess my bias is towards surely we should just be able to explain the facts and everyone will change their decisions. That's just breathtakingly naive. And I had a similar conversation with Alex Lockwood recently, whose focuses on about whether you like it or not, the way human minds have evolved. narratives are really what drives much more of our decision making than having a spreadsheet or a list of facts. Or so it's, I think that's a very powerful point. And some of those influences can be really subtle as well. The way language is used, as you said, mainstream media, different portrayals can have a really important influence, much more sometimes than as you said, a documentary that's ramming a message down your throat. So
there's this book called *Sapiens* from Yuval Noah Harari, which is one of those big books that make a big difference in the world. And one of the things that the book really shows in your face is that our reality is myth-based. It's all about myths, and we cultivate those myths. And things that look very solid, like money, on health, or even law, they're myths that we just buy into it, believe it, because it's convenient to us to do so, rather than reality. So the history of humankind, Homo sapiens, is the history of deception. So it's not the history of learning about reality. It's the history of believing a falsehood, even when you already know it's a falsehood, but you find it more easy to do that. So therefore, if we want to advance in the same species rather than genetically modify us like that, we need myths to get us to the vegan world.
Yeah, and I think the only tuning, because I love Harari's work, and I've got him on our page as a suspected celebrity sentientist, because of course he's a vegan and he has a naturalistic worldview too. So I think he qualifies. But I do get a little bit nervous that he, again, flattens this idea of everything's a myth and everything's a story. I still think you can sensibly differentiate between a story where everyone knows it's fictional, right? It's supposed to be a story. No one's supposed to really believe the fact. It's a story we enjoy. So that's one type of story. There's a myth that is made up where people actually think it's true when it isn't. And I think that can be explicitly damaging. Not always, but often that can be damaging, like there is a hell, and if you don't follow this book, you're going to burn for eternity. Well, I think that's a damaging lie, right? That's not just a story that you might enjoy in fiction. That's a disconnect between reality and a falsehood that's being told. And I draw another distinction between that and something like money, which I don't think is fictional or a myth or a story at all, really. It's just a network of agreements that we have made about promising things to each other that actually does get instantiated in our minds and in spreadsheets and in other things. So this idea that money doesn't really exist, it's not real, I don't quite subscribe. I see that as yet another category of something that just is it's a different type of construct, but it's like if I said to you, I promise to make you a cup of coffee tomorrow, that's an agreement that is now in your mind and my mind. It's not a fiction. So I'm a bit stricter at breaking those things up, because I do worry that Harari's tone almost might lead some people to say, we can make up anything you like as long as it's effective. And I find that deeply disturbing. That seems to be where someone like a Jordan Peterson or someone else has gone, where, or Scott Adams, where it's, Scott Adams, where it's almost like there is no reality. It's all about competing myths. Make up any shit. And if you win, you've won. And I'm like, I'm not going there. So
no, I understand, but I think it's a matter of semantics. What it really means, myths. Myths, for me, myth doesn't is irrespective of whether it's true or not. Myth is a belief that has permeated culture, and people don't ask the questions anymore where this comes from. So it is all the acceptance of a narrative without even wondering if somebody created it or where it comes from. That's what a myth is. That might be a real thing that is based in reality, might be a complete fantasy, but it is the phenomenon of how people react to narratives what defines a myth, not the actual myth itself. Now, but myths that make it, those that are spread, are the good ones compared with the bad ones, in a sense that there is a competition of the stories and narratives. Some are more believable than others, some that require more explanation than others. So there is an evolution, a mimetic, as opposed to genetic evolution within myth that makes one survive better than the others. But I think that is irrelevant about how true they are or not. But if you have two myths that are very similar, and one is based in reality, the other isn't, I think evolution will give the one based in reality an edge. So I think, so therefore, the fact that it's a myth or not, you can make myths completely based on real things. And the fact that the ones we have are not, is not a fault of the myth system, which is the human way of looking at the world, is an explanation of the political and social systems that have control through controlling history books, through controlling education, which one survives, which ones don't.
Yeah. And so I think maybe that's where you and I probably share an optimism ultimately, because just mechanistically, I think it's obviously true that, whether it's the evolution of galaxies and solar systems, or it's biological evolution, or it's the development of memes and myths, patterns that are good at persisting tend to persist and replicate. I mean, it's a truism. So mechanically, that is going to happen, right? So the memes and the ideas that are best at spreading through human minds will spread, right? That's just how it works. But I think I share your optimism in that I do think that the stories and the narratives that have a better correlation with reality overall have an advantage. So I hope they will win out. We've seen many times over history where awful ideas have won, at least temporarily, but I think hopefully over time, ones that are more correlated with reality will win out. And I think there's a second source of optimism, which you've already talked about, which is that hopefully, again, over time, myths and stories that have this ahimsa, do no harm, some sort of compassion at their heart, again, because cooperation is adaptive, over time, are more likely to win out as well. There's no guarantee, but hopefully, reality-based and compassion-based ideas over time will win out. But I guess that's the fight we're all part of as well. So.
I agree. And it's a matter, again, of a speculation all through. But the reality is, at the long term, we all be gone because the sun will get bigger. We'll never reach another star. So
the heat death of the universe.
And the reason I'm saying that is not to get a pessimistic ending, is the opposite, to get an optimistic ending. It doesn't really matter that much what you do, because it's not going to be up to you how the things end. So you don't have to be too worried about do I do the right thing? Have I written the right book? Just simplify your life by listen to your instincts and look at nature, the things you have around, and you'll see that your instincts are there to help you, and they are not there to make your life more complicated. You look at nature, they have very good ways to solve problems. So if you have to solve problems, nature. So the more you detach yourself from your own reality, who you are, and the natural world, the more you're going to be lost in a completely circle of in reality, within another reality, within another reality. That is what will create the anxiety and the worriness and the guilt that make you feel bad about things. So in the end, remove yourself from that guilt. And that's my first book, the novel, that was that. I became a vegan when I wrote that novel, that I was trapped in this guilt circle, and I just got rid of the guilt and said, don't consume any animals, and the life becomes so easier. That's such a simple decision. That is the thing. The message I want to kind of put forward is, when you make decisions like that, becoming vegan, that they sometimes look scary, sometimes look bizarre, sometimes look radical. In fact, they're just easy things for you to be better with yourself, not with the world, with society, for yourself. And you learn that by being true to your true nature, which is not a predatory carnivorous animal, suddenly everything falls into place, and all the things that were working. So, and the bigger picture, we're going to be gone at one point, but between now and then, how can we help? Just think about as simple as that. How can we help the next generation?
Yeah, I love it. That's an inspiring message to close on. I agree. Right? There's no cosmic scoreboard at the heat death of the universe that will tell us whether we're meaningful or not, or good or bad. That's a ridiculous idea. And we can revel in a realistic understanding of what we are and what that means about how we feel, and we can have that compassion for ourselves too. And as I say, I had that same experience of the vegan journey. It was as much a gift to myself as it was to helping others. So I think that realistic understanding of who and what we are as a sort of weird variety of ape, and having compassion for ourselves is a really good, important starting point, and gives us a solid base, if we have the capacity and the capability to try and help others too. So we might not know how to get there, but we share a hope that we'll be moving towards an Ahimsa future. So it's an inspiring message. Well, it's been a genuine pleasure talking to you, Jordi. What's the best way of people following you, learning about your work, reading your writing?
The best way is to Google my name. We have Google these days, you see?
Yes,
Google my name.
I have heard of it.
Anything I write, it's going to be there. Then you see what I write and see what other people write about me, which is as important as what I want to say.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And I'll include links to your Twitter and your homepage and various other things in the show notes too. It's been a genuine pleasure to speak to you, a real inspiration. And yeah, thank you so much for spending time with me on Sentientist Conversations.
Well, thanks for having me.